Hello, and welcome back to Boundless and Bottomless Seas. We continue our long march through Fourth Political Theory by Aleksandr Dugin. For those of you who want a break from this, you can go listen to the episode where Parkinson of Cosmonaut fame and I do the entirety of one book in one episode, and also make a foray into Dugin's application to MAGA communism to some degree. What I will say is the difference is the Putin versus Putin book is actually a very direct book where Dugin is not hiding what he believes. Whereas this book is, I don't think Dugin's hiding what he's believed, but this is very much a everything in the kitchen sink sort of, I'm going to throw out enough different theories and ideologies at you that rhyme with what I'm trying to push, that surely something's going to stick, and then I can get you later. Whereas Putin versus Putin was written a little later than this book, but it was clearly written for a Russian audience, as opposed to this book, which does not seem like it was actually written for a Russian audience, even though it was published in Russian first. And I think it does change the matter of discussion. But we are in the middle of one of the chapters.
We're tonic shit.
Yeah. We're halfway through the book. And so we're going to try to skip up. We stopped on Butin's discussion of why we needed to reject and criticize fascism for its racial component, which we've mentioned over and over and over again, that Dugin definitely knows better, that that's not actually the defining historical definition of fascism. It's only really the defining historical definition of Nazism.
Yeah.
Right. And we have also come to the conclusion that it is fair to call Dugin a post-fascist. It probably isn't fair to call him a Nazi per se, if you're being rigorous at all.
And I think you should be.
Yeah. If only for the reason you point out in the episode with Donald Parkinson is that doesn't play so good for a Russian audience.
No.
He's over there.
So here's what's interesting. We're halfway through the book, and in Dugin's own words, consequently, it is about time that we pose the question of searching for the fourth political theory.
Finally.
Halfway through the book, we should probably start talking about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I feel like this book so far has been like, here's what it's not. Also, here's what it might be. Let me throw some particularly insane ideas at you, including that maybe abstract ideas should have human rights, but humans shouldn't. And stuff like that. But let's get into this. We do get to an interesting discussion of modernization. I'll just read it real fast. Dugin says, thus, modernization is a concept that sends us back directly to the three classical political ideologies. Furthermore, we see the common ground that unites these three ideologies through the idea of progress and their positive evaluation in the concept of modernization. Nowadays, all three of these ideologies have been gradually discarded. This is strongly evident in regard to fascism and communism. I don't know, it seems less argument in regards to communism than it was in 2009 when this was written.
Yeah.
But it is somewhat less obvious in regards to liberalism. I don't think it's that not obvious anymore. Even liberals don't seem to like liberalism anymore.
Yeah.
But even liberalism is gradually ceding to satisfy the majority of the world's population and simultaneously turning into something other than what it was during the classical era of modernity. And again, this is Dugin repeating himself. He's already said that he thinks all that's left of liberalism is its atomization. He actually, while seeming to critique Fukuyama, actually agrees with him.
Right. At least in the main point, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe not in... He doesn't think that it's over. I'm not sure that Fukuyama thinks that it's over all the time. He's just saying that so far nothing else has been successful.
It's resolved into the individual.
Right.
And it's got a faith in progress despite, not having progressed.
Consequently, it's about time for us to pose a question of searching for the fourth political theory beyond the first three, although the radical rejection of the first three theories reflects our attitude towards what is common in all of them. That is the attitude towards modernization process, evolution, development, and growth. So, degrowth communism maybe Dugin would be down with it. No,
what's funny about this is that, like, if you strip away a lot of the insane nonsense, this basic concept of the radical rejection of the three classical theories on the basis of progress and evolution and development and growth, it's like, that's pretty sound. That's a reason to keep reading. It's a reason to want to engage. All the other stuff is a reason to put the book down.
Well, I mean, one thing I'll say is I don't think we actually can say modernization, progress, evolution, development, and growth are all the same thing.
No.
And but I would say also that those parts of the three great ideologies were critiqued in the fucking 70s by post-structuralists, like,
right.
And I think Dugin's picking up on that. So then he mentions Gregory Bateson, who is an ethno-sociologist and a cybernetics theorist, as well as an ecologist. Bateson is interesting. I've talked a little bit about him, actually, in my discussions on cybernetics. He comes in when cybernetics really gets bogged down. And cybernetics gets bogged down because the initial wave of cybernetic theories was dependent on behavioralism. And while behaviorism works in that, like, people who are trained in behavior, like, operant conditioning or whatever, that stuff does work. We have learned through the study of the brain that no, the brain does not work like a servo-mechanic mechanism. Like, cognitivism actually has won out. There is a structure to human thought. Why it exists, if it's genetic, all that stuff isn't settled. But what we can say is if maybe not one structure, but there are several structures of human thought that repeat over and over again, and that they are not just about behavioral reinforcement inputs. So that actually set cybernetics into a tizzy. When socialists wanted to return to cybernetics, they don't go to late cybernetics. They go to early cybernetic theory. There's two reasons for that. Early cybernetic theory is closer and related to the theories that were coming out of the Soviet Union. And the other reason is that the problems with cognitivism versus behavioralism are not as obvious in early cybernetic theory, even though they're all basing their assumptions that humans basically work like machines, and that machine learning and human learning are basically the same thing. And that's not really true. And now there's a lot of people who attack cybernetic theory for more like post-structurally weird ways, but I think that's something, and I'm guilty of this myself. I actually also discovered cybernetics late, went back and went through early cybernetic theory, and then like actually started, I worked my way through as systemically as I can, and then I realized, oh shit, there's a reason why this only ended up being used in machines. Right. And that's because
it presumes a machine model for
cognition
and cognition and nature.
Right.
I'm referring to like the Adam Curtis documentary. That's like as much as I know about cybernetics, all watched over by machines of loving grace.
Yeah. I have read most of the early books now, but I finally got into like, okay, what happened? Why did this stall out and only get used in computers? Okay. So Bateson's interesting because Bateson tries to set up cybernetics on more sound ground. And he was an anthropologist, a semiotician. He was an anthropologist. I mean, like, he's kind of impressive, the number of different social sciences he specialized in. And when he was specializing in it, he was super important to the early cybernetics stuff in the 40s to the 60s in the Macy conferences. And then in the 50s, he was big on the group processes.
Was he American or British?
He was British.
Okay, interesting. I was going to ask if he worked for the Rand Corporation, but I guess not.
No, he was British, although he was married to Margaret Mead.
Oh, okay.
So
big name,
right? So he is trying to. I think he realizes before everyone else does that some of the servo-mechanic assumptions of cybernetics were going to be a problem, And so he really kind of expands all this out. This is where the monotonic versus polytonic processes come from. I mean, like, that's what's going on here. So let's just talk about what a monotonic process is. A monotonic process is the idea of constant growth, constant accumulation, and steady progress.
It always goes one way.
Always goes one way, but in only one indicator. All right. So it's one variable, constant, steady progress, which is what markets like.
GDP. Yeah.
GDP, etc. Although we've seen GDP doesn't steadily progress. It's like early period, it's like 20-30%.
Yeah.
It waveforms, then it like periods out between 3 and 5.
Right.
At least so far.
But in aggregate, or at least ideologically and historically, it is tended towards monotonic growth.
Right. Now, monotonic processes proceed in one direction. And he divides them up into 3 basic categories. I don't think these categories are as sound as they initially seem, but it is trying to get away from the idea that they're all the same thing that you get in some other forms of cybernetic theory. So you have biological monotonic process, mechanical monotonic processes, and sociological or social monotonic processes.
Right.
Okay. Monotonic process in biology is incompatible with life. Like, it's just true. I mean, even Bateson realizes it. What is something with steady growth that does not stop? Cancer.
Viruses.
Viruses. Things that wipe out populations, like
which is
pollution.
Things which negate life.
Mm-hmm.
Like capital.
Right.
Yeah.
So, as Bateson realizes, and I think correctly, Dugin picks up on, monotonic processes do not begin. He talks about, he uses un-PC language, but like if a monotonic process begins, you get a lot of genetic deviation. He calls it deviants, giants, dwarfs, and other freaks of neighbor that tend to be sterile. I actually think you can just talk about the removal of telomerase. If you remove telomerase, that is the enzyme in your cells that tells it when your cells need to start to die. What happens? You get cancer. You have uncontrolled cell growth that'll kill you.
That's pretty open and shut.
Yeah. Because people tried to remove telomerase because it would end aging theoretically. Right. But apparently you can't overcome entropy in biology.
Yeah. It's a separate question whether or not you would want to, but you shouldn't, and you can't. So that kind of makes sense, actually.
Right.
Silicon supermen keep trying, though.
Right.
Fountain of youth.
So then Dugin discusses Bateson's discussions of monotonic processes and mechanics, and he specifically talks about steam engines. And I'll just read it here. Solving the problem of monotonic processes was one of the most important problems of the development of the steam engines. It turns out that the most important design element in steam engines is its centrifugal governor. When a steam engine reaches cruise speed, it is necessary to regulate the intake of fuel. Otherwise, a monotonic process initiates and everything begins to resonate, and the speed of the engine can increase indefinitely, causing it to explode. Basically, you get an overload pattern. It is precisely the only solution of avoiding monotonic process and mechanics that was purely theoretical, mathematical, and physical and engineering problem during the early stages of industrialization. It turns out that monotonic processes are not only incompatible with life, but also with the proper functioning of a mechanical device. All right, so you throw too much energy into something, and it proceeds at pace with throwing energy into it, and you just continue pushing at a regular basis. What's going to happen? You basically have a bomb.
Yeah,
and you're going to increase. You're going to move from speed of motion into maximum entropy when everything flies out and then falls apart. So again, incompatible with functioning. And then lastly, Bateson shows that monotonic processes in sociology usually lead to wars. Are basically, if human society worked monotonically, Malthus would be correct.
Right.
But we don't actually work that way.
Yeah.
That's why Malthus is not actually correct.
Right. We very clearly don't work that way.
We don't run by the principles of steam engines, nor by the principle of like capital and GDP, right? As much as we want to extract ourselves from the world of nature and from, you know, the state of the environment, we can't do so. Although we seem to be trying when it comes to anthropogenic climate change.
So one thing I will say about Dugin here, this one page is smarter than the rest of the book that we read prior. like I'm just
he's grounded. He's grounded in something, right? He's flying off into space. He's not like posing like I'm going to conjecture this and then never conjecturing it.
I mean, I feel like not every page has been bad.
Either.
It's not his work, yeah.
I feel like there's been a couple of spots where he's been a little bit more grounded, but those spots are peppered in sometimes very long, like whole chapters of just like what am I reading? You know, like I just don't know.
I think his critiques of liberalism actually tend to be fairly good. I mean,
I think he would do very well to have a good editor, which just did not have.
But as we've been saying through the course of this, like even his critique of liberalism is in this abstract realm of ideas. So even when he's grounding it in realities that we understand and processes that we get, there's no like material substrate to that. There's no like dynamic.
This is the first time we've gotten to a material substrate, and it's actually just him glossing someone else, but he's glossing it well. Right. Like, so I mean, like finally we're like, okay, entropy exists. Monotonic processes are not possible forever.
4 chapters in. Woo!
Cool.
Now where does he go with this?
Right. All right. So then we get to Marcel Mauss, and this criticizes monotonic processes and social functions. And it's specifically Marcel Mauss's 2 famous works, Sacrifices, Nature, and Functions. I read this when I was also reading René Girard's I see something fall like lightning, and all of his weird trying to explain Christianity and human sacrifice through mimesis.
This is like anthropology 101 stuff. Like
it's early 20th century anthropology, better than Fraser. And actually, Marcel Mauss ended up being correct about like the stuff about the gift economies and all this in a way that like Marxists tended to avoid because it's not in classical political economy. Right. Because classical political autonomy study of the past was actually hypothetical. It was all based on Hobbes or Locke or whatever.
But anarchists ran with, right? Like
anarchists ran with Mauss, although Mauss was not an anarchist, which is also an interesting thing. He was actually like a right-wing social democrat-ish kind of person. White ring, I just mean like he would be on, like today we'd say he'd like on the Democratic side of the DSA, like the Democratic Party side of the DSA or something. That's really kind of where he was. There's a lot, like Graeber tries to make Mauss out to be a secret anarchist in some books by like saying, well, he was just afraid of Sorel, and like, but Graeber just basically conjectured that and made it up.
And let's not forget that the Situationists were obsessed with the conception of potlatch, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
They were kind of
very much so.
Although they got it, I mean, they got it from Bataille's use of mouse. So, which, by the way, Bataille, most batshit Marxist kind of thinker in the history.
I never read Bataille, but everybody I know who references him is kind of a crank. So I don't know what that means.
I've never read Bataille either, but I kind of feel like the most batshit Marxist adjacent person it's a highly contested space, but I think Lysenko, Trofim Lysenko definitely is a challenger anyways.
Fair. Bataille wanted to kill people. Lysenko did kill people.
Right.
I actually own all of Bataille's books back there because he's so fucking crazy.
Nobody ever said you weren't a crank, my brother.
Yeah. I want to get a book reading group, but I can't do it for this series because we need to do something other than Dugin for a while, maybe something more normie, and B, it's not. I don't actually consider it a right-wing book, but I need to get a group of people to go and read for a show The Accursed Share Volume 1 and 2 with me, because it's both brilliant and absolutely insane. But anyway, so Dugin brings up Marcel Mauss, particularly the sacrificing the gifts, and he talks about surplus. A surplus is linked to excess. Lico and as Usurious, Lico personifies evil. Usury is a interest charge on borrowed capital and excess, that which is obtained beyond one's own needs. For example, surplus clocks is seen as disastrous in traditional society. The ancient world was based on the belief that an increase in one area translates to a decrease in another. The actual modern interpretations of this, though, of what Moose is describing, is also that surplus leads to class inequity, which is why relatively agrarian societies do not let surplus go unshared, so no one can hoard it. Right. And that's like enforced violently. And yes, it does limit production. I mean, like, but so this idea that it's only about like traditional norms, because Dugin very much believes in traditional feudal or Russian feudal hierarchy. He's got to like not mention that part of this. But anyway, for this purpose,
class society.
Yeah. For this purpose, community organized the feast, consuming all its additional food until they choked, or gave it to the gods in a form of sacrifice, gave it out to the needy, or destroyed it. This is the origins of a special ritual, the potlatch, which brings about deliberate gift gilding or the destruction of excess personal property. I actually do think some of this survives in the modern day. If you've ever like participated in Eid al-Adha, or you think about Christmas celebrations, what are things you're doing is you're forcing a lot of excess out into the public. I mean, if you even think about like the way Dickens characterizes this in A Christmas Carol, like it's like, you know, there's a time to get rid of your surplus and share it with the general population.
It's become more like this regulatory cycle for capitalism, because there's the whole conception of Black Friday, right? And the fact that every time there's some hiccup with the Suez Canal or the Red Sea, I don't know why that's happening, or the Panama Canal, we're reminded that all the Christmas orders start coming in during the summertime, right? And it's like this big moment where, like, within the regulatory cycle of capital accumulation, you have this massive consumption of things. So, like, what had begun as a religious tradition now has devolved into like a consumer frenzy, a way to eat up that surplus, as you said.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's interesting. Then we have a brief discussion of Durkheim, Sorokin, and Gurvich. Gurvich is the only one of those I don't know much about. So I'm just gonna, but anyone who's ever studied sociology has to deal with Durkheim. You quickly get into Levi Brunel and Claude Levi-Strauss. And Claude Levi-Strauss argues that primitive peoples in quotation marks aren't actually non-logical. We aren't, it's just that their priors and structure are different, right? But they actually do follow logic. And in fact, it's that anthropological insight that leads us to talk about logics and rationalisms, and not like Enlightenment logic and rationalism. Okay, and again, this is all coming very fast in Dugin, and it's glosses, but he's right. This is what the anthropological and sociological record illustrates. I find it interesting that he basically stops in the 1930s for talking about this stuff. The most modern person we get is Franz Boas.
Right, it's not very modern.
which I think that is somewhat telling. But he is actually picking up something that like you might hear from someone like Bruno Latour, that like, in that book, We've Never Been Modern. Like part of that argument is like, well, actually, no, most human thinking doesn't actually proceed along Enlightenment lines. Right. And to which I say, no fucking shit. So like, and I will say, if I have a critique of Marx, it is that at least early Marx has a kind of German ideal notion of the perpetual increase of the general intellect, that makes us more human, but not in a perfectly linear way. It's that Hegelian dialectical way, so it kind of looks like spirals. Right. And I do think one of the things that you have to deal with Marx is that the period of breakdown and decadence of capitalism that we live in now, he did consider a possibility in the middle and end of his life, but in the early part of his life, he pretty much argued that what's happening right now would have been possible.
Right.
Like the proletariat would have had to rise up by now. Like,
well, yeah, that's my criticism of Marxists. People who just like don't acknowledge that anything has changed, anything was wrong, anything's developed. It's always the first thing that I read, that's the best thing, and it's the only thing. And it's more interesting and more complicated than that.
Well, like Marx, they'll have to be disabused by a failed 1848 type revolution.
Well, here's the thing: you would think
seems like they would have been by now.
That we've only lived through a couple of them in the last decade. Like,
yeah,
and hope's eternal,
right? I mean, it does lead to interesting things like the MAGA communists arguing that Marxism is a meta religion, but that's a good thing, as opposed to like everyone else who's like, no, that's terrible, that's degenerate Marxism. But it's like, But
at that point, I would just take regular religion, which I did and do.
So, but weird syncretism with that in like Orthodox Christianity too, so it works out for them both ways.
Anyway. I just want to say that I think this part of the book is a fair gloss. Like I was reading this and I'm like, I don't think he's presenting the problems and these ideas unfair.
Oh, I still just don't know why he's presenting them to us. Like,
well, this is the first time he's given us anything like a anthropological material grounding for what he believes. Everything else has been idea. But then we immediately, so we've gotten this little section on sociology. By the way, guys, this has only been 3 pages. And like I've read half of it out loud.
Yeah, he's been very gracious in summarizing and skipping over, folks. This is condensed shit here.
But then we immediately jump to why Danielewski, Spengler, Schmidt, Younger, Heidegger, and Toynbee are right. Now, regrettable Jason, Toynbee will be familiar to you, even though for the people watching this episode will probably be released in the future to them. For us, it was recorded priorly, where we talked about theories of decadence. So what we have here is the theories of decadence and cycles. All right. And so Dugin is now arguing, not unlike you and me, Jason, that social systems have life cycles.
Well, and also there's another little thing that he this is something that is it's a gem that if you pull it out from the rest of the page, where he says progress is not an objective social phenomenon, but rather an artificial concept, a kind of scientifically formulated myth. I feel like that's worth dwelling on. Progress is not an objective social phenomenon, and I just think that's worthwhile to say.
Well, and it's also not always obvious. So one of the things that I have often thought about after the fall of the Roman Empire, in fact, we mentioned this on our No Royal Road episode, there were large parts of certain kinds of infrastructure and technology that were lost. So in Great Britain, people forgot how to make a saw.
Yeah.
In Egypt, people forgot how to make fucking pillars. So the mosque had to steal pillars from ancient temples. But they also didn't need to. It didn't actually lead to it. What's interesting is it didn't lead to a marked decline in life expectancy or anything from the bones that we have.
Right.
Like yes, there were less babies. There were less people born, but they lived just as long as they avoided war. So like
it was more like a decomplexification of the social system more than anything.
Well, and in some ways that was even a necessity, you might say. To go from the universal to the particular makes a new universal more possible, more of an aggregate of all the particulars. So like it's kind of hard to say whether or not that's progress, but it's definitely looks like a loop, like a spiral, and not like a straight line.
The one thing it will say for progress in German idealism is that progress in German idealism was actually eschatological. So it was not just about material progress. I mean, Hegel literally believed that freedom was being brought about through God's negative actions to clarify human agency, but it was God doing it. Like that's, and that's why it's the absolute idea, because ideas are our way of accessing the divine. That element of Hegel is like stripped out of modern Hegelians for the most part, because they don't want to deal with the fact that it is still theological. Because, you know, what somebody recently came at me when I was critiquing Chris Catrone, and I said, hey, look at this theological, you know, that when you talk about rights in bourgeois society, that they're theologically justified. They're deistically theologically justified, not Christian theology, but they're theologically justified.
Natural rights.
Well, right.
Yeah.
And they're all, and those deistic theological justifications are rooted in previous monotheistic theological justifications.
Right.
They're just you know, they're formulated anew and they're developed, but they have their roots that go further back.
Now, what I find interesting, and I think we're going to have to discuss this, is one of the things that have just traditionally been thrown at people who believe in progress is that it's a secularization of Christian eschatology. That the general critique on the right from non-Christian rightists was that, or even from Christian rightists actually, is that progress was Whiggish social history was a secularization of Christian thought, and that either we needed to reject this Christian thought a la Nietzsche, or that we needed to just be Christians a la most everybody else. And you know, I find it interesting that Dugin seems to be siding with the Nietzsche almost pagan argument here. Although this is also after he's clearly converted to Orthodox Christianity. So like Dugin's religious notions, the more I deal with them, the less coherent they seem. Unless there's something about Eastern Orthodox Christianity that I don't understand. And I've studied it more than most people I know. So it's just, I'm kind of, because there are things I could explain to you that are different about, like, say, Greek and Russian Orthodox Christianity from like Catholic thought, but progress isn't really one of them. You know, so in fact, there's this interesting thing in Eastern Orthodox Christianity where like the enemies of God are always doing God's work. So like any things that don't seem like progress, even things that seem like breakdown and decadence, are actually still operating of the hand of God, so God can reconstitute things better. And
we now call that the cunning of reason.
Right. So I mean, I do think that you know, there is some political theology under here, but it's actually really opaque, and it seems like half Christian and half not. Anyway, so he talks about this in terms of 19th century sociology after he lists all the breakdown theorists and conservative revolutionaries he likes. In fact, he just lists them in a way that I'm not even sure why he put them all together. Like, with regards to cultural studies and philosophy, I hate it when people do this. Nikolai Danielewski, Spengler, Schmidt, Junger, Heidegger, and Toynbee show that all process in history and philosophy and all history and culture are cyclical phenomena. I mean, they didn't actually show that. I mean, I agree that it's a cyclical phenomenon, actually, but none of those people actually prove what they set out to prove. So
this is another one of those examples where I think that Dugin would do very well to just dwell on this thought a little bit more, because I would even be willing to take his word, because, you know, I've read some Spengler and some, you know, smatterings of everybody, but I don't know a summary of their thought which could be seen as, if you took all of it and aggregated it into something, you could say, oh, and then that suggests this. There's no conclusion I could draw from that. But I would be willing to accept it if he would just outline it. He just doesn't for some reason.
Well, it's just one of these things. I mean, one, to give Dugin, I shouldn't be giving Dugin credit, but like, you and I read enough academic bullshit after post-structuralism to know that people do this all the time. They'll just throw a list of names out there as if it represents a position that's been solved or disputed or what. Right.
Because the idea is like there's so much stuff back there that you would have to read. Like you'd have to spend years reading all of their thought in order to disprove the claim.
For somebody who hasn't read all of these, what I'm getting from it, or from like the context of it, is that hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, sort of meme, which
from Proclus to Ibn Khaldun to Toynbee. Like I could go. Well, to be quite frank with you, Sean, I mean, like Jason and I and Regrettable Chris are all doing a series on decadence theories, and we're actually gonna have to talk about all this because that is classical decadence theory.
Right.
Not that ICC shit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the ICC shit is a weird. The ICC shit is a weird combination of crisis theory with decadence theory that I'm still struggling to understand, because it's led a lot of people to think that crisis and breakdown theories are the same as decadence theory, and they're not. But I think the ICC is why they think that.
This is not the International Criminal Court, by the way, folks.
No, yeah, it's the other one. Although, as I made a tweet about
ICC,
as I made a tweet about, I now get confused because I spend such a long time in weird sectarian things and also commenting on the news. If I'm talking about the International Communist Current or the International Criminal Court, like I can't always tell which one I'm referring to.
Yeah.
I guess I would prefer if the International Communist Current was in charge of more things.
Also the International Criminal Court.
Yeah.
Swap places. Like the International Criminal Court should just be little groups of people in like all the countries of the world who have this little program, and they like maybe pass out a pamphlet at a strike every once in a while.
So that's a good program. I like Sean for president.
Right.
So we have this. So we get to this Petor Stomka. I hope I have Polish people. Correct me. My God. I actually really wished that Polish was transliterated into English the way Russian is, because then you probably pronounce it right.
Well, actually, I mean, this is Piotr Stomka. Yeah, Stomka. So basically, like, it's Piotr. That's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah.
And Stomka, just make the Z into an
keep
it a Z, but add an H to it. Yeah.
Okay, so it's SZH. Stomka.
Yeah.
Okay.
Stomka. Piotr Stomka.
All right. I always get confused though when it's like Pers, when there's a P, and I'm like, do I pronounce the P or not? Like, anyway, a contemporary Polish sociologist stated that in terms of progress was viewed, there was a change in the humanities. In the 19th century, everyone believed that progress existed and that it was the principal axiom and a scientific criterion. But if we examine the paradigms of the 20th century in the humanities and the natural sciences, we will see that almost everyone rejected them. No one is guided by it any longer. Now named, the paradigm of progress is considered almost anti-scientific. It is incompatible with the criteria of contemporary science, just as it is incompatible with the criteria of humanism and tolerance. Any idea of progress is in itself veiled or direct racism. God, I really do feel like this could be like a Robin DiAngelo speech. Assessing that our culture, for instance, the white or American culture, is of higher value than your culture. That's just culture of Muslims, Africans, Muslims, Iraqis, or Afghans. And as soon as we say that the American or Russian culture is better than that of the Chukchi or the inhabitants of the Northern Caucasus, we act like racists. And it's thus incompatible with both science and with basic respect towards different ethnicities. I mean, woke Dugin is a meme I can get from this book.
Yeah.
I mean,
it would be really interesting.
Racists.
It would be really interesting to read an updated version of this, where he says, where he has to contend with not just the notion that paradigm of progress is considered anti-scientific, but that actually Steven Pinker has a a huge amount of sway in the liberal intellectual world. And the idea of progress is very much an idea he promotes.
Yeah.
Well, this is one of the things I was going to say. This book was written around the time that people tried to resurrect progress narratives, where this whole neo enlightenment stuff tried to come in at the end of the aughts, like Pinker and Jonathan Haidt to a lesser degree. A lot of the early IDW people before they lost their mind.
Well, also all the new atheists, like Richard Dawkins, all those people, like this is the modern era. We move past this backward thinking, and with progress, we're going to get more enlightened. So you're behind, and we're going to catch up with us. That was their whole thing.
They also referred to reason without any caveats.
Maybe I'm asking too much of Dugin here, but like, what happens between the 19th and the 20th century where conceptions of unilinear progress break down? Could probably be the Great War, and then like the ideologies that came out of that.
Right, and then also World War II and the Holocaust, and
all that stuff. But again,
and the Great Depression. That's another thing he has not yet talked about is anything in the material existence of people's lives. Exactly. It's just ideas purely. It's actual idealism.
Except when he's glossing sociologists who have to deal with material matter, like right?
Only in terms of their systems, right?
Right. Yes. 20th century science uses cyclicity as a scientific criterion, according to Stomka. We have moved beyond the paradigm of evolution, modernization, and development to the paradigm of crisis and catastrophes. No, we haven't. Yeah, no one's abandoned the paradigm of evolution. In fact, we just dropped the idea that evolution was actually about progress. It's just about adaptability to whatever cycle that you're in.
Right.
I just want to point that out because he is doing, like, he's laying this good stuff out to do something, but God, I hate when people do this. By sneaking a couple of terms in there that let you think that people have rejected something they haven't, because they have rejected something that sounds like it. And no, not every process is cyclic either. Most processes are cyclic, but not every process is cyclic. This means that all process, this is where we get into like where he uses this in a way that's dishonest. This means that all processes in nature, society, and technology must be conceived as relative, reversible, and cyclical. Okay, here's the thing. Relative, reversible, and cyclical are not the same thing. And no, not all processes are reversible. You don't reverse atomic decay.
Right, and they're not all cyclical either. Now, you might make the case that they should be, but that's not the same thing as thinking that they are.
Right.
Yeah, and it's also an issue of scale, right? Because you could say the heat death of the universe will be like the end of the cycle, but then it's something so grand and large and spanned out in time that like it doesn't really explain much of anything.
Yeah, like that's beyond in every scope, no matter how great. Any philosophy cannot possibly take into consideration the scope.
The end of all being are the beginning of all being. Like
at that point, it's not worth doing.
Yeah.
I mean, the way that people classically got around this is just like everything's eternal. Goodbye.
Like unless the lesson here is just live your life and don't worry about stuff because it's all going to end and I'll start over anyways at some point, and that's not his point. At least I don't think it is.
Well,
unless that's the point, then you just have to move on.
It does seem like he's trying to scientificize using the critique of monotonic processes and using that critique correctly, but trying to use it to posit some kind of Christian version of Nietzsche's eternal return.
Right, yeah.
Like, I really do think that's what's going on here. And I think he almost says it. Okay, I'll just skip down to this point. And most important, instead of growth, progress, and development, there is life. I mean, life is about growth, progress, and development. It's just not infinite. I don't know how you, like, this is such a weird false binary. After all, there has been no proof offered yet that life is linked to growth. What?
Beings grow.
Yes, there is plenty of that life is linked to growth. I literally cannot think of a life that starts and ends in stasis. It's kind of definitionally not the case.
Right.
In fact, I think definitionally that's death. Like,
yeah, I think. I mean, I think I understand his point, except for I think that's a really, really clumsy way to make it, and I feel like if that's not a mistranslation, it's just a really, really bad way to make the point.
He's trying to say that instead of these like abstractions imposed upon the world, there's simply like bare life. There's like life processes, and then in his political philosophical worldview, like battles over ideas. And
well, I mean, this is the issue, is if you want to, like, you can make this argument if you want to go into ecology. There is life, and thus growth, progress, and development are always domain specific and never generalizable.
Right.
Because
this is the thing, is like when he says this was the myth of the 19th century, I think what he's saying there is that like there is a myth of the 19th century, which is that because life has growth as a critical factor, and that's how you measure whether or not life is still happening. Based on that, the 19th century was full of attempts to naturalize political, socio-political developments, and that's not possible. But rather than saying that, he's just saying life is not linked to growth. And it's like, well, that's not true, though. It's just a really bad point. And embedded within it is a really good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. But then he goes directly into and just admits what I think he's doing, right? Like, I'm like, aha, I suspect you're trying to secularize Nietzsche. And we get to that. Life in contrast is connected to the eternal return.
Return.
What? like you have not justified that at all in any of the prior paragraphs. The fact that things operate
or the following paragraphs.
Right. The fact that things operate in cycles does not mean they eternally return as the exact same. It's anyway. It's either a misunderstanding of Nietzsche, a misunderstanding of ecology, or I suspect a deliberately misrepresentation of both.
Yeah.
I think it's probably that.
Anyway, in the end, even Nietzsche incorporated the idea of the power into his concept of eternal return. The very logic of life to which Nietzsche was dedicated told him that there is growth in life, the Apollonian movement towards logos, then the balance of the nocturnal Dionysian world exists as well. I mean, that's early. He's also reading Nietzsche as if Nietzsche was a systematic philosopher, which is usually a bad idea. And Apollo is just not opposed to Dionysus. They complement each other. The other half constitutes modernization, while the other half decline. When it faces up, the other half faces down. There is no life without death, no being towards death, culture attention to death, to the flip side of the spirit being, as Heidegger wrote. It's not a struggle with life, but rather its glorification and its foundation. Okay, I'll give Heidegger credit for one non-stupid idea that he used in very stupid ways to justify people throwing their lives away for no good reason. But at base, it's actually not a terrible point. So we must put an end to the antiquated political ideologies and theories for even more antiquated political ideologies and theories.
Like eternal return.
And if we truly rejected Marxism and fascism, then what remains to reject is liberalism. Well, it seems like fascism and Marxism just came back since you wrote this, man.
That's true.
Maybe we're just going through liberalism backwards, but maybe simultaneously. I feel like one of the interesting things about right now is in the decadence of what we could call bourgeois society's liberalism, we are seeing all the dumb ideas of liberalism coexist at one time.
Yeah.
Without
any mass political basis for them.
Right, because we're all atomized, right? So we can just pick up the parts of the liberal past that we like and hold on to it for dear life. And pick your poison about what part of liberalism you particularly want to hold on to.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I get that. Sure. The term liberalism is equated with the terms communism and fascism. Liberalism is responsible for no fewer historic crimes than fascism, Auschwitz, and communism, the Gulag. It is responsible for slavery. It is responsible for the destruction of Native Americans in the United States, for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for the aggression in Serbia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. I mean, he's not going to mention any of this in Russia, of course. He's just going to mention the obvious Atlantis
The
stuff.
war in Chechnya.
Yeah.
We can blame, too.
Well, people should listen to what he has to say about the war in Chechnya in his Putin versus Putin book.
One of his 12 labors.
Yeah. Oh my God, that was really funny. The 12 labors, only 6 of which has he accomplished, and 2 of which he didn't even finish. And I was like, okay, man.
Nice selection, though.
For the devastation and economic exploitation of millions of people on the planet, and for the ignoble and cynical lies which whitewashes his history. So I'm just going to say that Dugin's right about that, but that's not all liberalism was. Right. And that's, I mean, in some ways, I do still take the old Marxist thing as we have to look at how amazing and amazing in both senses of the term. Like amazing and impressive and amazing and terrifying. Right. Early liberalism really was. Like, it really did disrupt historic lifeways. And it didn't destroy them, it incorporated them.
Mm-hmm. Right. Sublated them, if you will.
Right.
Yeah, actually, like Hegel's theory of progress, of the way that reason guides human history to, grasping toward the absolute idea as freedom unfolds, is actually perfectly illustrated all the way up until around 1945. And part of that is what liberalism has done, and including the terrible things, what's called the slaughter bench of history. It's like, yes, it's terrible, and it's also great, and it is great. And then the last few decades makes me think, I don't know, maybe I haven't lived long enough. Maybe in 50 more years, I'll say, that was all just bad stuff that led to good stuff. But so far, all I can see is mostly doesn't really look so good anymore.
It feels like, from the standpoint of today, we do need to put ourselves into the standpoint of, like, if we don't come to terms with the 20th century and how it really was different, it's like not coming to terms with the 14th century in Europe and how it really was different. Right. Like, and if you don't do that, you are going to set yourself up to repeat a lot of the worst elements of it. And we are I really do believe we are at a decision point right now, because these systems are decaying. The decay of liberalism, it's not just a decay of Americanism, motherfuckers. Look at Europe. Look at even China. China's slowing down. It's a decay of liberalism. But that decay isn't just a decay of an idea or just about individual atomization. There's economic and physiological processes behind it. And that's the maddening thing about these kinds of, and not just Dugin. I mean, this is the maddening thing about a lot of these theories, that they will only gloss, kind of like liberals themselves. They're only gloss looking the material conditions and contextualizing their own existence.
Yep.
Like Dugin doesn't contextualize himself in this. He sees himself as somehow outside of it, which is laughable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Say what you want about Marxism.
Anyway, so I'll just read this last little part, then we're finally through this fucking chapter. We must also abandon the philosophy of development and propose the following slogan: life is more important than growth. Hey, I agree.
Yeah, I would say that's a decent one.
Sure.
Instead of an ideology of development, we need to place our bets on an ideology of conservatism and conservation.
Less agree.
I don't necessarily disagree, but just on the face of it, I think we definitely need to hear more, because conservation, I'm for that.
Sure. What are we conserving, though? Are we like
exactly
belt, or are we like
well, like conservatism, like depending on what that means, I might be for it, but based on what it means in the US right now, I'm not for it at all.
I don't think I'd be for it in Russia either, quite frankly.
Yeah, me neither.
Conservative
towards the USSR, like return to USSR.
Yeah, so like conservatism in our daily lives, sure, I think I might agree, but I just want to know what that means, and I'm guessing I'm not going to find out what that means in the next paragraph before this chapter ends.
No, I mean,
I'm just going to say I disagree. I think just to be safe, I'll just disagree.
All right,
it's fair.
Instead of a history of development, we need a place based on conservatism and conservation. We need not only require conservatism in our daily lives, but also in our philosophical conservatism. We need a philosophy of conservatism. Looking towards the future of the Russian political system, we're going to be if it's going to be based on monotonic processes, then it's doomed to failure. This actually does come up in his Putin versus Putin book, where he kind of like thinks that some of Putin's problems are understandable because of we can't move unilaterally, and so like he does actually, I think he really does believe this isn't just him throwing out whatever to catch everybody. Right. But I do think we need to read this book partly with he's throwing out everything in the kitchen sink to catch everybody. So even though he's also telling, I mean, what's amazing about this book is both extremely cynical and extremely not cynical at once. He'll just flat out tell you he's throwing everything out the kitchen sink to catch everybody. Yeah. Like he said it a couple of times. Like,
and more than that too, he's imploring you, the reader, to help build forth political theory. Right? Mm-hmm. He's throwing the kitchen sink at you, and he's saying, "Here, let's fix this thing. Let's put some plumbing in it."
You know, so we find ourselves in a traditional state. We roughly know that we are moving away from, but we do not know what we are moving towards. Yet if we head towards which direction or indirectly implies belief in monotonic processes, then we will reach a dead end. I mean, his point about monotonic processes is good. But there are other processes other than cyclic and monotonic, and he's just like ignoring that. Like complex systems theories is not about either cycles or uniform progress. Like, in fact, these cycles interact and interrupt each other, and like, you know, this is a hidden metaphysics, but it's a weird one, and I find it interesting that no one's called him a heretic. It's like my real frustration with people who, like Christians who defend Jordan Peterson. Can anyone just say he's a heretic? Because he is. Like, if you're an actual believing Christian, this motherfucker's a heretic. He can't even say he believes in God.
No, yeah, that's an important part of being a Christian too.
Similarly here, like, does he believe in Christian theology or does he believe in some Nietzschean eternal return? They're incompatible.
I think he's trying to say that there's some basis for something in both, but again, it's like we're a little bit more than halfway through the book now, and it's not clear what he's trying to say yet.
Yeah,
right. And so I'm inclined to think he doesn't have a position yet.
Okay, now we get to the crazy fun shit.
All right, let's do it.
But something that I think is absurd. Because here's one thing. I don't believe in progress, but time's arrow moves one fucking direction.
In my experience.
Unless you're a subatomic particle.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, like, and again, he kind of even says that because he says, like, as we look to the future, and he talks a lot about the future and the march of time. And so when he says, in this next chapter, the reversibility of time, I think there's a better way to say what he's trying to say, because I think that there are things that he says which I think I agree with, but I think in general the way that he presents itself is it's not helpful. It's not correct.
But haven't we guessed in previous episodes of this that like his attempt at being esoteric and like his use of jargon and throwing the kitchen sink at everything is a cynical move because he's attempting to obscure like the actual basis for his philosophy, which is like German national conservatism of the 1920s and 30s,
and the parts of fascism he likes, but you know, not what he doesn't.
Parts of Italian fascism, like white Russian immigrants and Denikin's army and all that good stuff.
Well, yeah, like he ends this chapter with a quote from Arthur Muller-Vandenbroek. It's like that should say a lot more about what he thinks and what he's trying to reach for than what he actually says.
Yeah.
Also, I pointed out in MAGA Communists, they cited conservative revolutionaries way more than they cited any Marxists. Marxists were never cited in specific. They were always cited like as a generic partisan force, a la Schmidt. The fact that people think that's even about Stalin is kind of ludicrous to me. And that's one of the dangers of this everything in the kitchen sink philosophy. It it's incomplete so you can project upon it, but it's also not so incomplete that you can actually build it. There is this is about subordinating you to another idea and just making you believe that you have part in constructing it.
Right.
And in that, let's get back to the reversibility of time. So, okay, big bad. We finally get to the big bad.
Sorry, before we finish, go into this chapter, can we pause it?
Yeah, I'll try not to sleep through it.
All right. We're recording, and for those of you who were wondering, we took a break, and we talked about Doomer shit, which is apt for this book, but not the topic, so we not including it today.
Yeah. Another day.
But we get to Dugin's Bête Noire, and Dugin's Bête Noire is Jason's buddy.
That's true.
It's good old.
Is it Hegel?
Hegel.
It's Hegel.
All right, let's just read it. The three political theories have produced an ideology produced from the ideology of modernity. They're all based on the topography of progress. Okay, so the first part of that's kind of useless and very much reified. The second is true. Progress implicates the irreversibility of time, a forward-moving predetermined evolutionary process.
Two different things.
Yeah, I was about to say, no, evolutionary process is not predetermined. That's actually part of the fucking point. Otherwise you'd be saying it's a eschatological progress. But you can't say that.
Point. This is another point where I feel like it's worth mentioning that Dugin would do very well to mention that he's taking aim at something very specific, which the rest of the world is not really so much in the know about. And that's the way that Marxism was taught in the Soviet Union. So Dugin has a big issue with a certain understanding of Hegel and a certain understanding of Marx, and those are not shared in the West. I mean, they are a little bit, but very little.
Dugin was like slapped on the wrist by a Soviet teacher in high school who was a big Hegelian, and he hasn't gotten over it since.
Yeah, basically. That's the impression I get reading this. I was like, who are you really mad at? Because first of all, I don't think you know enough Hegel to say all this, but even more to the point, I just feel like you're wrong a little bit, and that matters.
Yeah, progress is both orthogenic and monotonic processes. Okay, so orthogenic. Let's talk about what that means.
Yeah, I need to know what that means because I'm out of the loop.
Orthogenic is the use of corrective interventions to promote all aspects of healthy development.
So breeding of animals. No?
No, it's not just that. It's also like providing corrective treatment for disabled children.
Okay.
But it also means progressive evolution or evolutionary progress. So it's actually just renaming the thing he's talking about, except that it is intervention towards helping the evolutionary progress. So it's not just the evolutionary progress is happening, but also we have to build it. So he's not totally wrong. Inevitably, all three are based on Hegel's philosophy. Okay, inevitably, all three are based on Hegel's philosophy. What makes that inevitable? Also, Whiggish history predates Hegel by a lot. Like, like seriously, you start seeing it as early as like, fuck me, probably Erasmus, like in like Christian humanism, even.
Yeah.
But anyway, Hegel's everybody's Bête Noire.
He really is.
Sometimes I do sort of agree with the platypoids on this, that like Hegel is the highest stage of bourgeois consciousness, which is also why Hegel's everybody's enemy. But anyway, Marx accepted this typography, and after Aleksandr Kojev and Francis Fukuyama, liberal thinkers have accepted it as well. In the framework of National Socialism, Hegelianism was externalized to the concept of the final Reich, with the Third Reich as the third kingdom of Joachim Faure, and in the concept of social Darwinism, where the theory of natural selection has been adapted to apply to societies and races. Hegel is not responsible for social Darwinism, sorry. Yeah, like that actually in some ways is a separate development. And that's because German idealism didn't actually have as much effect that early on English thought. They had already had their own Whiggish bullshit.
Yeah.
Like, that wasn't as smart as Hegel's, to be quite frank. So, a social Darwinism is also inherent in Spencer's liberalism. I'm not sure that I think Hegel thought of. I mean, Hegel was a racist. I don't think we can get around that. Like, that's just a historical fact. But I don't know that Hegel would have been okay with anything like social Darwinism.
I don't think so.
He might have been okay with something like White Man's Burden, but justified on completely different grounds. Like, so it's an interesting thing. Each of these three ideologies is based on the premises of the irreversibility of time and of the unidirectional history.
It's kind of the basis for how I see the world too. Things happen, and then there's the present, and then the future is different from that.
Yeah, I kind of feel like what Dugin, what he's going to outline in this chapter is not really well described by the reversibility of time. It's like, that's a turn of phrase that does not help him at all.
It's a metaphor he keeps using, and I'm not sure it's...
Because what he's really doing is he's talking about irreversible, the notion of irreversible progress, of stages of development, which are like, we're in this stage now, so we can't go back to that stage.
Yeah.
That's not the same thing as the linearity of time, which is in fact, mathematically just part of the universe.
Yeah, well, time is linear except for subatomic particles, as I said. So, right. So maybe at some level it's not linear, but we don't perceive it that way, at least not in this lifetime. And I'm not venturing on what any other lifetime might have for me, or even if there is one. So, like,
right. Well, and also one other kind of small quibble, whatever criticism I have of Dugin and his treatment of Hegel is it's like, for how esoteric Dugin is trying to be about, distinct periods in history, seems like he would have already uncovered the possible interpretation of the end of history as a time that we still live in, that Hegel lived in, and we also still live in, and that it's actually, it's not at all the idea of basically what the Soviet Union taught. There's another interpretation of Hegel, which I think is richer and a lot more valid. He just doesn't take that up at all, which is unfortunate because I feel like he actually would do well. He would be very interesting if he did.
It would also help if he read the parts of Marx that criticized Hegel.
Yeah. I think he probably is not even,
he's probably aware of them, but
yeah.
But it's easy to shoot down like his Soviet schoolboy vulgar Marxism, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and also, like, when would he be in school? It'd been like what,
70s?
Andropov, and it's like he's like in the period of the great old men, like Andropov and Chernenko and
that gerontocracy,
and like Gorby's the young one,
Yeah, no, exactly. Not an inspiring time to be a Marxist.
No,
true.
No, like, and then look at what you had in China, like Dung, Zeman, Huden Chow. Like, it's just,
tough times. She had Pol Pot, brother number one.
Yeah, honestly, like, unless you were a French intellectual and you were like messing around with the post of whatever, I can kind of understand why you would be very conservative in the 70s, 80s, and 90s as you're trying to cast about looking for some way to engage with history and society. I can understand it, but I can't excuse it. There's different There's different. These are different things. Yeah.
The implicitly acknowledging internalizing imperative of modernization. Modernization can be liberal, communist, or fascist. Oh, there's no other forms of modernity, dude. Okay, whatever. Like,
well, honestly, so far, no, there's not.
But isn't modernity and modernization can be two different things, right?
Well, I would push back on that. What the fuck is Saudi Arabia out of those three?
True.
I would say it's a part of the liberal world order, but I guess you're right. Saudi Arabia is not exactly liberal.
No,
it's liberal in the sense that it operates according to the world market, and the world market is liberalism, I guess. But there's a little bit of slippage in the use of these distinct terms to encapsulate too much. So I think I take your point. Yeah,
there are pockets of illiberalism and modernity that can survive that are not fascist or communist. They also kind of suck, but like
right. But that doesn't mean they're not there.
Right. And now I would say ultimately yes. The totality of modern society is liberal. Like there are things that are not liberal in it, but they are, whether or not people like it or not. And Dugin doesn't like it, and neither do some people who like to somehow pretend China's not subjected to the world market or whatever. National polities are still subjected to the overall world market system, and that even decoupling hasn't changed that at all. So,
yeah, and back to Saudi Arabia, there are certainly liberal aspects of that regime. Like they have rule of law. You know, it's not meted out in the same way that it would be elsewhere, but they do have like a body of laws that's.
Well, and divided in an even development, North Africa and West Asia is actually really hard to parse on liberal schemas because it's like they're like partly integrated, but they skipped whole steps. Like national development was imposed on them; it wasn't organic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, like. And this isn't to say that like somehow the Arab world was like super backwards or anything. That's not even what I'm implying. It just was developing on a different trajectory until basically the 19th century. You know, when the Ottomans decided they wanted to be Europeans, like, but just like Muslim ones. Anyway, the fourth political theory is an unmodern theory. Okay, so we get another negation. So what is fourth politics? Not modernity. What the fuck is that? Shut up.
In reverse.
As Bruno Latour said, we have never been contemporary. I mean, the way that's translated in English is we've never been modern. And that book is weird. I mean, I don't love all that book, but I do think there is a way that we overstate the way most people think. Like, both in the sense that, like, non-Enlightenment peoples, non-bourgeois subjects actually have fairly articulated systems of reason that are pretty much dependent on the same kind of modern brain and do accumulate knowledge in some ways in very sophisticated ways that we like don't attribute to. Because in some ways, they're using mental technologies as a replacement for physical ones.
Right.
But in other ways, I mean, in other ways, like when I think we've never been modern, I'm like, yeah, it's kind of true. But also, there's no human today who could be a true 3rd century BCE or 6th century BCE Platonist. That is foregone to us. We can't there's no one who's going to be a Christian of the 5th century.
That's true.
That world is foreclosed to us. We do not exist in those conditions. We cannot undo what we know. Like, the vast accumulation of history is still accumulating. And in that sense, too, time is not reversible. Now, that is different from saying progress is going to proceed in a monotonic fashion. And why is he equating this? I mean, I actually don't, like, I'm with Jason. I don't know what he is getting from equating this exactly.
I think he thinks it makes it clear if it just simplifies it, because this is a problem I've noticed in lots of different coming from lots of different places. There's this tendency in the world, to, especially in the world of people like Dugin, who are trying to be very intellectual, but also trying to be very clear and very easily understood. This concept, this tendency to kind of collapse concepts to the point of basically making it unclear, but in the other direction. So if it's very complicated, you try to simplify it, and it's too simple instead. And either way, it's just not helpful.
Yeah. So Dugin references himself, post-philosophy are the sociology of the imagination and the sociology of Russian society. Time is a social phenomenon. Its structures do not depend on their objectives, but are built upon the domination of social paradigms because the object is assigned by society itself. Okay, so I actually want to parse this because this actually is a substantive philosophical claim. And this clarifies what he means by the irreversibility of time. He is not referring to the linearity of events, right? He is referring to our social construction around that linearity.
Exactly. And that distinction takes it from being a meaningless turn of phrase to a meaningful discussion. But what's critical here is that it takes us to do it for him.
Yeah. In modern society, time is seen as irreversible, progressive, and unidirectional. Except that he's already said that we don't see time as progressive and unidirectional as in the 20th century.
Right.
Like, which one is it, motherfucker?
Yeah.
Well, right. And once I know that I'm going to say this often, but the problem here is that he's just simplifying things. Because what he's really saying, or at least what to read it charitably, what I would say he's saying, or what he should be saying, is that in general, people see it this way, even if in the scientific world, in very small circles of the people who dictate what will become popular thought later, they've already given up on it. And we just haven't caught up to it yet.
I would say that he's also arguing that contemporary people don't see it that way. So who does? I think he would say political people see it that way, but he doesn't say that. Like, he's fixing it for him.
The next sentence says, in modern society, time is seen as irreversible, progressive, and unidirectional. But this is not necessarily true inside societies that do not accept modernity, right? As though it's a choice, right? It's a political choice to accept modernity. So presumably Russia can refuse anymore to accept modernity.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the
process or a historical stage or like the product of history. It instead becomes a choice.
Right. This is the Heideggerian existentialism rearing its head again, that you can choose this.
Yeah.
Although I don't know how collective choice works. And that's why he starts positing things like non-human ideal actors. Like, there is actually a reason why he's positing these things, but he's not spelling it out.
Right.
Because if you break this back to material, our ideas about modernity are kind of irrelevant. Yes, we can alter it because our ways of viewing society, just like he said, gives us the ability to alter, the way we understand the objects of society is a social normative phenomenon. The way I break down the world does require a theory. And it is more than just an assemblage of random facts. Just by the fact I can articulate it in language, right? He's not wrong about that. But if you make it, because what he's trying to argue is like, basically modern society sees it as wealth, but not all societies are modern. It's really only the Atlanticists that are modern. Can they choose to be something else? That's not clear. But anyway, but then he does this shit. This is the stuff he does where A equals also not A, right? Like, fourth political theory does not just discard progress and modernization. However, although you just said what fourth political theory was unmodernity, right? This theory contemplates progress and modernization relative to and intimately connected with current historical, social, political, and semantic occasions, and an occasionalist theory. I think that's a weird translation. I think we might call it events, because that's the word that Heidegger would use.
Okay.
Events, yeah, I think that it's more meaningful that way. Occasions seems like, that's an occasion. Oh, whatever, that's an occasion. An event is like, it's more substantive.
So then all this rant about progress and the reversibility of time, and then he says what I say. Progress and monetization are real, but they are relative, not absolute. They are domain specific, relative to a specific goal and a specific set of things. So they have a specific teleology that is human decided in the case of humans. And if it's not human, then it doesn't have a teleology for me, because I don't think there's a fucking invisible hand guiding all of society some way, or all of nature, not just society, all of nature some way. So, I don't think of evolution as progressive. I think of it as stochastic, actually. There's a tendency towards equilibrium, but if you have total equilibrium, you're dead because you're in stasis. So ecologies are always going through cycles of trying to reach some kind of balance with itself and then undoing that.
Yeah.
Because that's what animals do in their internal processes too. Right. And plants as well. Things that are alive. And that involves growth, but also retreat and death. And it's very specific to each individual organism and system and subsystem. So sure. But the moment you say that, then this whole big rant about progress is just handled by, okay, so yeah, there's no general progress, but there is progress in specific things. And we can figure that out as a society. That's not that big of a revelation. Well,
I mean, among us, it's not, but I kind of think it is in general. Like, okay. I kind of think most people do sort of tend toward that. I don't think quite as much as he thinks they do. But again, I have a different most people than he does.
Right. Well, his theory of what Americans are seems to be through the internet and through TV. Like, quite frankly,
that's a really those are bad places to get anything.
Be honest with you, most people are just trying to get by, man.
Right. This is why fourth political theory suggests an alternate vision of political history based on systematized occasionalism. And again, I think I think it's eventism, because that's how we would translate the Heidegger word in English. Okay. But anyway, so I could be trying to fix this. Maybe in Russian, it's clearly something else, but I don't think so. I think that's what he's referring to. Carl Schmitt was very close to this in his work. This was not something I was expecting. The Annals School and World Systems Theory show back up right after mentioning Carl Schmitt. Ferdinand Brundel and the École des Annuels, or the Annals School, has been inspired by this in their writing. Okay, but be more specific. This is where I'm like, cite or at least gloss well. Like, now that we know that he can gloss, when he doesn't, I think maybe he's overclaiming.
Yeah. Or he's slipping them in for their prestige, or
or the ability to see, like, it's not all right wingers. See, leftists, you can get on board.
That might,
even if we're conservative, like, in discussions of the political transformation. of society. Okay. We place them in their specific semantic context: history, religion, philosophy, economics, and culture, with its ethnic and ethno-sociological specifics considered. Different peoples are substantively different for Dugin. Like they are for Spengler. Like,
yeah, and apparently it seems to be in the same ways.
Yeah. This demands a new classification of social and political transformation. We acknowledge these transformations, but do not place them onto a broad-based scale that could be called the common destiny for all societies. This gives us political pluralism. I don't know that I believe it's pluralism. I'm not even sure that that's actually implicated in what he says, but maybe it is. Fourth political theory uses a societally dependent conception of reversible time. Okay, so this is just a dumb way to state what he's trying to say. But in the context of modernity, turning back from some point in history to the previous one is impossible. But it is possible in the context of fourth political theory. Bernadette's ideas of the New Middle Ages is quite applicable. Society can be variously built and transformed. The experience of the 1990s is quite demonstrative of this. People in the Soviet Union were sure that socialism would proceed from capitalism and not vice versa. I don't know in the 1920s that they were actually sure about that in their own society. In fact, there's whole debates about that, but whatever. They were sure about it in the 70s, so sure.
Well, yeah, I kind of think that this is a decent point. Like, this is an actually clear statement of his actual case. Not so much a reversibility of time, but the way that we socially construct the meaning of development of time.
Yeah.
Right. I think he makes that point very well here.
Right. Back in the 1990s, they saw the opposite: capitalism following socialism. It is quite possible that Russia could yet see feudalism or even slave-owning society, or perhaps even communism or primordial society emerge after that. And he would like that, I think.
I think so too. Yeah.
Those who laugh at this are comparatives. Are captives of the modern and its hypnosis. No, I think all those could come back actually.
Yeah.
Although I will say, there are reasons why slave-owning society doesn't come back beyond just the goodness of our hearts. Slaves are not super productive.
Yeah, it's a very inefficient way of doing things. A slave-owning society might reemerge after nuclear war, but
that is we're giving up on progress, and we're giving up on efficiency. We're giving up on
that's true.
Even like the liberal conception of the economy. Then maybe in the future for Dugin, Russia where those are gone would be accepting of slave society because they'd have a different sort of.
Actually, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. For political constructs and then reconstructs society behind modern axiom. That is why elements of different political forms can be used in fourth political theory without any connection to time scale. Basically, because we socially construct time, we can do whatever the fuck we want. There are no stages or epochs. Some of this is actually the same thing as post-structuralism, though. Post-structuralists all made these arguments like 30 years before Dugin did.
Well, yeah, and I feel like I have to point out that for how heavily he tilts at Hegel because of his kind of linear progression of time is concerned, what he's actually positing is that the fourth political theory is a sublation of all the previous political theories. So he's actually talking about what he's doing is Hegelianism. He's just calling it not Hegelianism.
There are no stages and epochs, only preconcepts. And concepts. In this context, theological construction, antiquity, caste, and other aspects of traditional society are only some possible variants, along with socialism, Keynesian theory, free markets, parliamentary democracy, or nationalisms. They are simply forms, but they would not be related to an implied topography of objective historical time. There is no such thing. If time is historical, it cannot be objective. Dasein says the same. Dasein is the subject of the fourth political theory, so being itself. Dasein can be recovered by the refinement of existential truth derived from ontological structures of society. Dasein is something that institutionalizes them. Durant institutionalizes time by the tracheum, I think. That's how you say that. Tectium? I don't know.
Whichever. They're all probably all of those are fine.
I'm so out of my fucking depths by the time he brings up this shit. I don't know.
Tractetium and Dasein is not you have to know fascist and post-fascist versions of existentialism, dude.
I'm ignorant.
This is a problem that I have in trying to address a lot of this, and a lot of people who are believers in this stuff will tell me I'm bullshitting them, that I don't know what I'm saying. And I'm like, no, most people don't know this philosophy. I actually do come from the right wing. I've read all this stuff. I read it sympathetically at first, even though I never was on the full Heidegger train. And I've tried to deal with the implications of it. And so this is why something that is institutionalized by politics in the context of fourth political category. Time is a political category. The understanding of time is a political category, dude.
Yeah.
Political time is a pre-concept of a political form.
Political time is a pre-concept of a political form. So it's what, like the precondition for a political form to arise? Is that
right? I mean, and in this sense, I would say that there's something to this. So, for example, if you survive the Bronze Age collapse, if that even was a thing, or it was several things, a lot of those societies in around the Mediterranean developed a memory of a golden age. Like,
yeah, I think it was a thing, but I think you're probably right to say as a thing, it was actually several things.
Right.
If we wanted this to be like use Marxism as an example, I think that's kind of true, right? If we say that like Marxism as an enlightenment philosophy imposes like a sense of not, if not stagism, it's at least like social evolution, then like it is a precondition for building a political form, that can gather people together into a party, for example.
But the reason why it's a precondition though for Marx is not because of the party, it's because it's a precondition for understanding how you set up social relations so that you can set up a mode of production.
Yeah.
Right. Like, it is not a precondition.
It's not a voluntaristic thing.
No, I mean, well, Marx and voluntarism is weird. Like, one of the critiques you can make of Marx is he tries to have his cake and eat it too on determinism. But particularly early Marx, like, we are both voluntaristically doing this, but what we're doing is inevitable.
Right.
Like,
very powerful, as it turns out.
That's because, well, whatever. Marx is more indebted to the milieu of the young Hegelians than he wanted to admit.
Right, and it takes political crisis in the 1850s and failure in 1848 for him to really come to terms with a lot of that.
Yeah.
And our platypus friends would say, well, that led to the development of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think they're right about that, although it was also in debates with Blanqui that they don't really acknowledge. Or they don't talk about. Let me not say that. I don't know that they acknowledge it or not. But that's not the only change. Like, the immiserationist thesis does not seem to be operational for Marx in the First International. That is not what Marx is arguing in the First International.
Right.
Right. He clearly did believe it in the 1840s.
Yeah.
So it's nonetheless. The fourth political theory is not an invitation to return to traditional society. It's not conservatism in the conventional sense. There are many elements of our chronological past which are pleasant, and many which are not. This is the ultimate have your cake and eat it too, because Dasein. Like, I am fascinated structurally how similarly this argument goes to David Graeber. But anyway, finally, the ethnic and sociological matrices, the context of different contemporary societies, are also different from each other. Therefore, political theory should not impose anything on anyone except for the Atlanticist, which we need to oppose and destroy. I just
isn't by their own theory the Atlanticists are like there's something about their civilization that they're forced to impose themselves because of their like expansionist sea power and bourgeoisie.
Right. Yeah.
So how could you exist alongside that, like in a political pluralistic environment if you're Dugin?
I don't know, man.
I don't think you could, but I also don't think that we ever thought so anyways. Like before Dugin, up until really the late Khrushchev era, the expectation was always that one or the other system was going to win out.
Right.
True.
And detente
and we were better for it, actually.
Tournament.
Right.
Like on either side.
Ceasefire. Yeah.
Right. Like, it's like we're making detente so we can develop, but and so we're avoiding war, but one of us will still win. That was the idea.
Right. And in the meantime, we'll fight proxy conflicts, which is why Angola happens and why Mozambique happens. And you pick a place. Anytime there's a conflict, that was what the Cold War was.
which is why this feels like the Cold War, but also like the 19th century, because in some ways it is a Cold War. We got proxy conflicts popping up everywhere. But in another sense, there's not really a substantive ideological difference between, say, China and the United States that is that deep.
No.
Well, yeah, it's much more just raw power. It's just pure self-interest on national terms or whatever.
It's weird. There's
ideological.
More of a modus vivendi between the Soviet Union, say in the 1970s, than there is like between Russia and the collective West today.
But the other thing, the reason why I think this is structurally similar to Graeber is that there's an absolute volunteerism with no ecological conditions in it, except for very vague ones like land versus sea based.
Yeah.
Trade versus agriculture. Although, ironically, a lot of what's made Russia more powerful because of being forced out of the international system, it's actually finally fucking developed its internal consumer goods market.
Right.
So, like,
they've been trying to get light consumer manufacturing done there for like fucking 80 years. 90
right.
years.
They both
about
have
100
and
years.
they both have and haven't. One of the most fascinating things about that is they keep on talking about the need to do it, but then for whatever reason, they would make policy choices not to. Now, in the case of Ukraine, it actually has put them in a kind of decent situation because they have a traditional like heavy industry that they can just crank out artillery, and the West kind of doesn't anymore. Like no one here is just like cranking out old-fashioned tanks.
Just to put them in a warehouse somewhere in case that they become useful in the future. Let's just stockpile 30 million artillery shells. In just-in-time production, you would never do that, right?
Right. And that's actually part of why we can't face the Houthis in the Red Sea. Because we are now pure sea power, which means that we can blow shit up, but conquering stuff and actually subduing stuff, like that would require us to risk our own people and mobilize society again, and that's not profitable at this point. So why do that?
And yet, bizarrely, they're accusing Russia of like territorial aggression, and saying, "Oh, well, Russia can only take like 100 meters of ground per month or something like that." When Russia's actually seems to be fighting seriously a demilitarization campaign where territory is less important than actually like through attrition destroying the men and materials of the foreign powers.
Oh, it's a Clausewitzian war.
Yeah.
And the thing that Russia needs to be careful of is if they succeed, actually, if they don't have popular legitimacy in the areas they take over. And as long as they stay east of Karthik, they do.
Yeah.
But if they don't have popular legitimacy in the areas they take over, they will be in a fourth generation war very quickly.
With incredible backing by the West. I mean, it'll be a field day, right?
Right. And I want people to think about that, because when we lost the Iraq war. No, we didn't. We failed.
Yeah. That's
losing and failure are different things.
Yeah.
What did we fail to do? Well, we actually met, like when Bush put mission accomplished and they had they destroyed the Ba'athist Party. They actually did meet their political objective.
Yeah.
Right.
It just was chaos afterwards. And the U.S. kind of cared and kind of didn't.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think the U.S. cared at all. I also think that's the reason why the Russian military has not really advanced beyond the very eastern couple of
Me too. I think they're
the Oblast.
I think they've only been baited into this Kharkov offensive because they want to create a buffer zone so Belgorod doesn't get fucking artillery stricken every single day.
Right. But like, there's so much like commentary on the liberal side of the press about how the Russian advance is stalling and whatever. So, no, the Russian advance just doesn't have anywhere else to go. It just wants you to stop. And then they want to take over this and stay there.
Yep.
And you don't like that, and so say that.
If you keep throwing men up against the wall, they can live with that too.
Yeah. Anyways,
I think this is interesting to talk about, though, because in some ways it puts truth to the lie that this is not that Russia is not a liberal society.
Right.
It's operating under market dictums. It's using 19th century warfare, early 20th century warfare. I mean, what we're learning is land warfare was still at its high point so far in the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Even though it was developed by the sea powers, weirdly.
But whereas air power is going through incredible evolution right now with drones. I mean, we're seeing the kind of science fiction shit that 10, 20 years ago people were.
But the problem with that is that can just kill people. It can't conquer them.
Right.
Right. That's how you can achieve your objectives and still fail. You can win, and also doesn't matter that you won.
The dirty secret too is and Mike McNair makes this point, is that like every nation state, every bourgeois nation state has its acceptable parties and its unacceptable parties. In the United States, we know what those are. In terms of like what like the dominant party is in Russia, Putin and company are accountable to the people. They care deeply about public opinion. It's not this like crazy autocracy. They have like a federated form of government, and people in different spheres are accountable to people, and they care very much about whether or not it's like a legitimate war or not. And they'll do the same when those 4 new conquered territories come into the Russian Federation. They'll rebuild them, as they've been doing in Mariupol and other places where they've secured their rule. It's
however,
just like they did in Chechnya.
However, if you do have a real attempt to rebuild the Ruski Mir, that will lead to a world war.
I think that's probably right.
They're not gutsy enough to try that, but God, things just keep escalating. Tit for tat.
I kind of think that they might be. I think that I take very seriously what's his name? He's Douglas McGregor. He's a conservative figure. He's a former general,
Colonel.
General.
Yeah, Colonel.
Colonel. Yeah, and he says that like for the Russians, this is an existential conflict, which means that nuclear war is way more probable than we want it to be. Because for the Russians, it's way more of an option than it is for us. Because if they lose, why not take everybody else out on their way down?
Said that the other day in a speech.
He said it many times.
If they're going to threaten our state, if our state is going to fade away, then why not? Why wouldn't we just go all the way with it? You know?
Well, yeah, because like, you know, I don't live there, but I can.
See,
I can
but the thing is with
appreciate
that,
how like you would think a world without Russia is a world not worth living in.
The thing is about
Russia,
that, though,
is kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
The thing about that is, eventually he loses his other allies.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a restraining factor for sure. And that's why I think the Ruski Mir thing, because of course, too, he's accountable to the weird nebulous, like counter-systemic block that's being created right now that isn't like a full.
And only one of whom has real power.
Right. Yeah.
China. Well, I guess India kind of does too, but like India and China don't share interests, which is why the BRICS are not a good political bloc.
And China only started sharing interests with Russia in a serious way a few years ago. You know?
Well, yes and no. I mean, like the other thing is part of the Eurasian vision would threaten China. Like I think that's an unspoken implication in all this stuff. Because where would they go? They would be surrounded by a massive civilization on one end and a massive civilization on the other, and then they want to fight the West. Well, they can't really like. What would they benefit? China's going to take over the United States in a southern project? That ain't happening.
Yeah.
So like, and they're not going to have the people to do it soon either, despite their huge population. So like, because their population is old.
And this whole thing is really, if you consider like the best of all possible worlds, actually, let's say before the Maidan uprising, Russia could have been like a transit state, like an entrepot state, trading natural gas with Europe on the one hand, and also trading oil with China on the other hand, and integrated like as a go-between between those two economies. But now that obviously is forced.
That was kind of their plan, actually.
It was, yeah.
You know what else we should probably finish?
We should
chapter.
end.
Yeah, we're actually at the end of the chapter. We
are done. We can define several pre-concepts with the reversibility of time with Dasein, which makes it existential, and thus ends. We finish a chapter and a half. That's another good day.
That's a good day.
That's another good day.
Really good day.
And we are now on chapter 5, global transition and its enemies. And then we get into the new. This is where the Alex Jones shit comes in.
Oh no! Is mine called Chapter 6, the Ontology of the Future? I don't know.
Mine too. Well, at least my PDF is, and my You know what's funny? In my book, it's chapter 5, global transition and its enemies. In my PDF, it's chapter 6, the ontology of the future.
The PDF has different titles.
Okay. But it's the same text. I don't think anywhere in your version, Varn, that you've been reading has been different text from mine. Like it also chapters and the numbers.
Because Sleboda is the major translator, I think, for both of them.
Okay.
Millerman reorganized this, as you know, and has popularized it. But and look, I mean, we'll get into this, but it is very clear that the liberal world order is decadent, but it is also clear to me that there is very little who choose to be outside of it that are. Most of the people outside of it are not outside of it by choice. They're outside of it because the liberal world order rejected them.
Right, like North Korea and Cuba and places who are just under heavy sanctions, and they don't want to be.
Right. Iran, etc. Like, so a lot of these weird, like, you know, what ideological basis is a Russia, China, India, Iran, South Africa, maybe Brazil sometimes, world order? There isn't any. There's no common. That's not a common turn. That's not even an anti-imperial axis, really.
Yeah.
No, but it is an anti-liberal systemic one, kind of. But kind of, because most of those states still want access to the West, particularly India and Brazil.
And if you believe Putin, if you take his words at face value, you may or may not, he even says that like the world still needs the United States. It needs like a large power like that. It needs like a repository for the rules-based internet.
I actually think Putin had his word.
Russia has its own sphere, and it will help the United States, you know, but we have to come to a new security agreement to make sure we have our interests, and then the U.S. can have the rest of the world.
No, I don't think he thinks the U.S. can have the rest of the world. I think Putin wants the multipolarity of the world formally acknowledged. And I'm just going to go out on the limb, and because people accuse me of being anti-multipolar because they don't understand what multipolarity is. I think all that would be doing would be acknowledging reality, and acknowledging reality would be a step forward.
But a step backward for the American ruling class. Because their ideas of progress and the unipolar.
But they don't fucking believe in the ideas of progress anymore anyway. Are they, like, what bourgeoisie is actually doing shit right now?
We have to believe it. The readers of the New York Times and the Washington Post need to believe it because they're the voting public who needs to vote these people back in so they can feel like they're part of this world historical project.
Do you know why everyone thinks the PMC is in charge of everything, even though they're not even a class? Because the bourgeoisie is fucking invisible right now. Because they have abrogated their responsibility to even their own stupid exploitatory system because they have accumulated so much, they don't need to be productive anymore.
Right. And they also don't have any counter-systemic force, any class force that could force them to come out into the open and actually rule.
I mean, the end of History and the Last Man is not a utopian work. It is actually describing what the repercussions are for liberalism winning.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, and I say that, Dugin's going to say it's utopian. It's not. Fukuyama does not think this is unilaterally good. Like, he does think that it's going to appeal to everyone. And the reason why it appeals to everyone is because everyone can see an interest as an individual. It's a like Rawlsian bargain thing. Like we don't all know what groups we belong to, but we all know that if we were respected as individuals, then our groups might still be allowed to exist. Like, and that's something communists haven't dealt with. We don't like dealing with other identities other than class that have purchase on people. Because we can't make them automatically go away. Like, you know, yes, there is a sense in which, yes, like, racial divisions divide the working class, but there's also a sense in which, like, those sociological divisions emerge from legitimate interest and are maintained by legitimate interest. And yes, those interests are not actually in the longue durée benefit of the working class at all, but they are in the interest of specific groups and individuals within it.
Absolutely.
And so, like, we have to deal with that. And until we do, this Duginist bullshit will catch a fair amount of people. Because it does, I mean, look, he's offering a non-liberal pluralism.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like, communism has never, the only thing we've done to come close to that is recognizing nations and tendencies. And communists have a rife with contradictions on how to handle those two things.
Yep.
Like, you know, so much so that our general sense of like programmatism, the problem with programmatism isn't the program. The problem with programmatism is mostly ideological based off of some preconceived notion that we can know what communism is before it even happens, which is weird to me. Since, yes, we do need some utopian guide, some positive program, right? But the idea that we can know the results of that positive program is something that Marx spent more ink fighting against than he did. But he still did political programs. And so this is something that we kind of have to, even when he disagreed with them, like he doesn't agree with all, if you actually read the program of the Communist League, one, which they didn't even use that program. They actually adopted a slightly different one. But two, the one that he wrote based off of what had been used priorly that went into the manifesto was not all endorsed by Marx. Like,
I think the good place to end this, to reiterate what you were saying before, is that as long as the decay of liberalism continues, and as long as there's no larger program, we're going to keep falling. People are going to keep falling back into this Dugin shit. You know,
they're going to fall back into all kinds of weird
sorts of shit, including the Dugin shit, and it's going to create all sorts of weird.
Because they're grasping to get out of the political paradigms that are given to them. Like, people want to get beyond left and right, but until you create the conditions of which that would be meaningful, all you are doing is falling back into a prior status quo, which means that you are right. Like, right. That is why beyond left and right ends up being right. It's not because the left and right are going to be eternally true. It's like some mixed metaphysical position. They're actually metaphors for kinds of development that happen under modern capitalist society and liberal modernity. And there are places where left and right doesn't really have purchase because they're not fully integrated in liberal modernity. Saudi Arabia, parts of the Middle East. But if you are integrated, then there's a left and a right. And it's a moving target, right? That's what people don't like. They want to get past that. But since they're not building anything new, and how would you build something new? You have to find a subject that could socially replicate both in production and in society itself, that goal. And this is a question that Dugin just doesn't answer. He thinks it's a choice. It's like Russia could just choose to do this somehow. Like, there's some collective agent called Russia that exists metaphysically that can choose this.
Choose not to accept modernity.
Right.
Well, these are the sort of sticky questions we're asking in the Independent Labor Club of New York and Arizona. So just had to serve myself right there. I gotta run.
All right, let's end this today. See you guys.